Today, we're diving into a story we all think we know, the Roman conquest of Britain. But what if the history books only gave us, half the picture? It turns out a pretty groundbreaking genetic study is completely rewriting our understanding of who the British people are. And the real answer? Well, it's been hidden in their DNA this whole time. Let's get into it.
So, who exactly are the British people? Seems like a pretty simple question, doesn't it? Well, it turns out the answer is way more complex than you might think. It's a huge story of identity, of invasion, and ultimately of survival. And the newest chapter, the most revealing one yet, isn't being read from some dusty old history book. Nope, it's coming straight from our DNA.
I mean, for generations, the story we've all been told about Britain is that it's just this long history of invasions, right? You've got this succession of different groups showing up, conquering, and basically replacing whoever was there before. You know the list: Romans, Anglo-Saxons, Vikings, Normans, each one leaving their stamp on the place. But what if that whole story isn't quite right?
Okay, so to really understand what happened, we've got to go back. We need to meet the people who were already there before the Roman eagles ever landed. So let's talk about the original Britons.
So, who were they? Well, they were the Celtic Britons, and starting way back in the Iron Age, they were the main culture all across the island. They spoke this language called Common Brittonic, which is pretty amazing because it's the direct ancestor of modern Welsh, Cornish, and even Breton over in France. And you gotta remember, this wasn't some single unified country. It was more like a really vibrant collection of different tribes and kingdoms that all shared a similar culture.
And don't think for a second that this was some primitive society. It was actually incredibly sophisticated. I mean, they were organized into all these different tribes and kingdoms, a lot of them based around these really impressive hill forts. They had a deep spiritual life led by druids, and they developed this unique and honestly beautiful art style. But the coolest part, for me anyway, is that last point. The southern tribes were so well connected with Europe that they were already minting their own coins long before a single Roman soldier set foot on the island. That's a big deal.
And then, of course, everything changed. In the 1st century AD, the massive Roman Empire decided to look north, across the Channel. And for the Britons, well, nothing was ever going to be the same again.
Now, Roman rule in Britain wasn't some brief in-and-out affair. We're talking about nearly 400 years. You can see on the timeline, it all kicks off with the invasion in 43 AD. But even then, it took them decades just to lock down the south. By 122, you have Hadrian's Wall, basically marking the edge of the empire. And this whole setup lasts all the way until about 410 AD. I mean, think about that. 4 centuries. That is an immense amount of time. You'd absolutely think that would be long enough to completely change a people, right? And, on the surface, it looked like it did. A new kind of hybrid culture started to emerge, this Romano-British identity. This was especially true in the southeast, where things were more urbanized. You had people speaking Latin right alongside their native Brittonic. They started adopting Roman customs, building those famous villas and living in Roman-style towns, the whole shebang. Which, of course, brings us to the absolute core question of all this. With all that cultural change, and with all these soldiers, administrators, and merchants moving all over the empire, did the actual gene pool in Britain change? Did the Britons, deep down in their DNA, actually become Roman? And now, for the very first time, we actually have a definitive answer to that question. And it's all thanks to this incredible genetic investigation that basically lets us look directly into the past. So what did they do? Researchers took ancient DNA from people who were buried at several different sites all across rural Cambridgeshire. And these sites cover the entire time the Romans were there. Now, this is super important because something like 90% of the population lived out in the countryside. So the scientists weren't looking at the top brass, the governors, or the elite soldiers. No, they were looking at regular, everyday farmers and villagers.
And the results? They were absolutely stunning. What this study found was that these rural communities, they were overwhelmingly made up of local people. Genetically speaking, they were basically identical to the Iron Age Britons who had lived in that exact same spot before the Romans even showed up. There was just no evidence of any significant migration from other parts of the empire into these communities. Almost none. Now, this is where it gets really fascinating because it shows this huge difference between life in the country and life in the city. Out in rural Cambridgeshire, the population stays genetically Briton. But in big urban centers like York, it was a totally different story. York was a true imperial melting pot.
Other studies there found a really cosmopolitan population, even including one person with ancestry from the Middle East or North Africa. So here's the key takeaway. Roman genetic influence definitely happened, but it seems like it was really concentrated in the cities and military forts, not among the huge majority of people living out in the countryside. Okay, so if the Romans didn't fundamentally change the DNA of Britain, then who did? Well, this study gives us a crystal clear answer. And it all happens in the period right after the Roman legions packed up and left.
The real major genetic shift for England came with the Anglo-Saxon migrations. You know, as the Roman administration was falling apart in the 5th century, you have these Germanic-speaking people from what's now Germany and Denmark starting to settle in eastern Britain. And their genetic impact wasn't just big, it was enormous.
Just look at this number. We're talking about, on average, anywhere from 38 to a whopping 75% new ancestry pouring into the English gene pool from that North Sea region. I mean, this was not just a small group moving in. This was a fundamental, large-scale shift. And really, this chart just says it all, doesn't it? The Roman era, for all of its incredible cultural and political power, left a tiny genetic footprint on most people. But the Anglo-Saxon era? That brought a massive and permanent genetic transformation.
And of course, this genetic change went hand in hand with huge political and cultural changes. This timeline really shows you how fast it happened. In just a couple of hundred years, the old Britain kingdoms basically fall, one by one. From Essex down south, all the way up to Elmet in the north, they were conquered and folded into new Anglo-Saxon kingdoms, the very kingdoms that would eventually become England.
But, and this is so important, that's not the end of the story for the Britons. They weren't just wiped out. Their story shifts. It becomes one of survival and of transformation under incredible pressure.
So as the Anglo-Saxon kingdoms got bigger and bigger, the Brittonic-speaking people were essentially pushed into the west and the north of the island. And over a long time, these separate groups evolved into distinct peoples that we still recognize today. You have the Welsh in Wales, the Cornish down in Cornwall, and even the Britons, who actually crossed the Channel and settled in what's now Brittany in France. And then you have the Cumbrians up in the old north of England.
So really, what you're seeing is this process of gradual replacement in the East, but this story of remarkable survival and persistence in the West. The original Britons didn't disappear. Their culture, their people, their center of gravity just shifted.
So what's the big idea here? What should we take away from all of this? It's that the old story, the one about simple conquest and replacement, is just incomplete. The real story of the people of Britain is also one of incredible, deep-rooted continuity. The original Iron Age population survived 400 years of Roman rule, and their descendants are absolutely still here with us today.
And what's so powerful about this kind of genetic research is that it shows us the story written in our DNA can tell us things that the history books just can't. It kind of gives a voice to that silent majority, right? The everyday farmers and villagers who were living their lives but rarely ever made it into the official records. And it leaves us with a really fascinating thought to end on. You know, we've all heard that saying, history is written by the victors, but as science keeps unlocking these secrets from our distant past, you have to wonder, what if the truest story, the most authentic history of all, has been carried inside us, in our DNA, this whole time?